lectures. And we're delighted to see you, and we know this has been such a stimulating week already, and we know we're also going to be in for a treat in just a few minutes, and we will have Laura Bachman introduce our speaker. But first I want to say a little bit about J.C. Wynn and the J.C. Wynn lectures. Dr. Wynn served on the faculty of this institution for 26 years. He is a professor of practical theology and the director of our graduate study program in family ministries. Dr. Wynn believed that the family was a legitimate mission field of the church, and he felt called to train person, lay, and ordained to service in this field, many of whom continue to offer their gifts to the church and community as pastoral counselors. Dr. Wynn served as a consultant to the World Council of Churches, as well as the Vatican on their commission for inter-Christian marriage. He is an honorably retired member of the clergy of the Presbyterian Church, USA. Dr. Wynn served as the chair of the Commission on Family Ministries of the National Council of Churches, and so much more. All you would need to do is look about J.C. Wynn, and you will find more than you ever could imagine one human being could do. Upon J.C.'s retirement in 1985, the John Charles and Rachel Wynn Family Ministers Fund was established as a way to honor J.C. and his work. In 1990, this annual lectureship was established to honor the work of Dr. Wynn as a practical theologian. So we are still in touch with Mrs. Wynn, and although she isn't able to be here with us in person, she does keep a close eye on who we invite and how we invite, and is always interested in making sure that the place of family ministry stays front and center in what we do here at Colgate Rochester Crozier. We always appreciate letting her know who's coming, and we always appreciate telling her about how well it went and how much we enjoyed it and how thought-provoking it was. And so we know that with confidence, we'll be able to report back to her again this year. So I want to introduce one of our students here at Colgate Rochester Crozier, Laura Bachman, who will introduce today's speaker. Laura.
So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gail O'Day, who is with us only for a short time. And so I have known her less than 24 hours, but I have learned a few things. She has a sense of humor. She is a fast runner, which she had to prove in Philadelphia when she had to get her flight, and she had a 5-minute transfer point. So we know she's flexible, and we know that she is happy to be here. And I'm happy that she's here. It turns out that we went to Brown, well, not together, but we were both Brown alums, so we had that to talk about last night. She is a graduate then of Harvard for her MDiv and Emory for her PhD, and she is a New Testament scholar who then moved from that also into preaching, and she's going to share probably both of those lenses with us today. She is the Dean and Professor of New Testament and Preaching at Wake Forest at the Divinity School, and her scholarly research focuses on the Gospel of John, the Bible, and preaching, and the history of biblical interpretation. And she is extremely busy because she's written a number of books and articles and is also editor or co-editor of several volumes, including the Oxford Access Bible and the Theological Bible Commentary. And she is now the general editor of the Society of Biblical Literature book series. So that is a lot of things, and we are looking forward to hearing them. So will you join me in a warm welcome for Dr. O'Day?
You almost got to see really how fast I run. We have double mics speaking to each other, I think. But now am I? Yeah.
No, turn the volume, master volume down on it.
Top left, Tom.
Speaking still.
Todd down here in case it goes again, so.
I took it off because it was.
If it happens again, just put that and stop.
Ah, of course it will. Well, I'm gonna protect my ears first, then I'm gonna do that. That's a good idea. Oh, he's gonna do that. You're gonna give my talk?
Test, 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 2, test, test.
3, 4, 1. I can try just to not do it, but I'm worried about the people in the back.
Test, test.
But I can probably do it without. Except I think they're also, they might be
Test, test,
recording it
two.
through the system.
Okay, back in business. Two. Test, test, okay.
All right, there you go. So if it happens again, just click that pop. Then stop.
I'm a little afraid to talk. But I'm going to try. All right, are we all, I think we're in a normal range of volume. Everybody is?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. And see, she said I can run fast and I'm flexible. There you go. I knew how to run across the room. I'm flexible. I want to start first by thanking, I think Stephanie was actually the person who issued the formal invitation, but I want to thank all of you at Colgate Rochester Crozier for inviting me here to share in this week of lectures. I'm honored to deliver the Wynn lecture. I didn't know him, but a friend of mine who started her teaching career here somehow was on your, I don't know, found something, I don't know how she found it. She sent me an email and said, hey, you're giving the Wynn lecture. And she told me how important he had been to her as she began her career and what a really important presence he had been for her. So that I was glad to have a kind of personal story about him, about J.C. Wynn, as well as the honor of giving the lecture. So tell Mrs. Wynn that.
I will.
That I was very happy to have that and to do that. All right, my talk is, I think, hopefully we'll talk on all the things. I don't know that I have the word family in it, but I will say something about intergenerational. So that, I think, that counts. All right, and my topic, no one said the exact topic. What's my exact title? Because I liked it. And I don't have it written down, I want to say it again. No, that's your time. That's your title. Yes.
Meeting the incarnation in the garden.
That's what I thought. Thank you. I knew it had the word incarnation, and I was just trying to get the correct phrase. Meeting the incarnation in the garden. And that will actually tell you the range of, I'm going to kind of approach this from two sides. One is really the kind of, because this is practical theology lecture. So one is, they'll be alternating between some practices side, and then, because I'm a New Testament scholar, also some New Testament, and we'll weave together the practice and the biblical scholarship, and hence that's what most practical theology is, weaving these things together. And that, yeah, your title is Sustaining God's Time, renewing or attending for God's creation. I'm going to start by, this is kind of the practical part, or the beginning of the practical part. I'm going to start by telling you a story out of my experience of, I think, why I was invited for this lecture, and then moving on, when you pay attention to this topic, why it makes a difference both for, I think, actually redefining practical theology, and I actually think for redefining theological education and for redefining ministry. Those are fairly substantial claims, but I actually feel that pretty strongly. So, I became the dean at Wake Forest University School of Divinity in fall of 2010. And I did what every new dean or president is supposed to do. You're supposed to have a listening tour. That's what, if you don't do that, you're a very bad first, new. You're always supposed to have a listening tour. So I did. I listened to what the dreams, hope, fears, and yes, if one is honest, boredoms of, people go, really, we have to keep doing this, of my new community. And I also listened, so part of a listening tour was listening to people. But what I also learned, and what was important to me, and where it relates to this lecture, and where I think it's important for practical theology, theological education, and ministry, is that I also tried very hard to listen to the place in which we were doing theological education. All right, so I'm going to use my place as a case study, but it expands. Right? You can know your place either here, and Rochester actually is a fascinating place for studying the history of what has happened to the economy, the industry, on the land, not on the land. How do you live in this place? So my place that I listened to was North Carolina, the state of North Carolina. And really thinking about how does the fact that we as an institution are in North Carolina, what difference does that make for who we are as an institution? So the same way, one of the first things we're thinking about place as a category for practical theology and theological education is, what difference does it make where I am? All right? Is every place the same? Is ministry the same every place? Or does it matter where I am? As I listen to people and place, my convictions deepen that the days of universal and universalizing theological education are behind us, if they ever existed, is of course an open question. Same for a kind of universal experience of ministry. But there is little doubt that those days, whether they ever really existed, is an open question, but they did exist in the minds of many, as the time when learning was learning, scholars were scholars, ministers were ministers, and we all agreed on a basic curriculum, a basic set of values, to teach a core set of universal truths. I might actually be at a school where that was not so much the case, because your history is one of bringing multiple voices together. So you, in a way, may actually have a head start on many of the rest of us, because you had more of a diverse history to start with. So pat yourself on the back. No, seriously, for that one, Mr. President. All right. By listening simultaneously to the place in which we educate, now for me, so you listen simultaneously to the place and to the students whom we educate, I learned a different and a more formative educational, and I would also say theological value. And to paraphrase, you'll recognize what's being paraphrased, that we have to educate, and then I would also say we have to minister. But we have to educate and minister where we are planted. To nurture our spiritual disciplines, we have to grow where we are planted. And to do that, we have to know how to attend to where we're planted. So we actually have to, I often say this to students, probably the greatest thing you can learn as a ministry skill is simply attentiveness and intentionality. And if all my students came away with attentiveness and intentionality, I would feel that I have been a success. Effective religious leaders are ministers in place, just by definition. And there may be some professions where place doesn't matter, but ministry, religious leaders are planted somewhere. They are ministers in place. Deeply engaged with the land, history, people, patterns of particular places. Firmly committed to the health and well-being of their locale and all its inhabitants, human and non-human. Through the lens of the particular issues of a place, religious leaders are able to see more vividly the web of connections of the local context with a global environment and a global economy. So in a way, ironically, the more you know the local, the better you can begin to understand the global, because you learn about the specific. And then you move specific to specific, not generalized to generalized, but you move specific to specific. Leadership in place is a practice, not a set of traits or qualities, but leadership is worked out through direct, persistent, active engagement with the needs, hopes, and possibilities of a particular community. Religious leaders bring to community and civic engagement the practices and traditions of a faith that is fully and courageously, most fully and most courageously lived when it is incarnated in the hopes and joys, sorrows and sufferings of a particular place and its inhabitants. And as educators, you have people that come to a school, and then, as all the alumni here will testify, and then go someplace else. What does that mean for educating in place? Well, because even though students, alums, clergy, are going to leave this place where they are being educated and lead in faith communities and organizations far from their starting place, they still will be in a place. And they will need to learn how to read a place, how to live with and be in a place, how to speak and practice their theological education in the particulars of that place and the particulars of their neighbors, human and non-human. And so listening, listening to my community, to my place, led me to contemplate a different kind of educational and theological goal. Perhaps we could form, perhaps this is our calling, to form the kind of religious leader who knows that they are called to love and lead in the particulars. So hence the incarnation in the title. And we can maybe grow that kind of leader and theological and spiritual and pastoral life if we shape our education and our ministries to be responsive to our particular places. So, for me, a case study of North Carolina. One of the particulars about North Carolina is that we live in a state whose history and economy was primarily shaped by the land. It's a beautiful state. Anybody from North Carolina? It runs from the mountains to the sea. There aren't many states that can say that. It runs from the mountains to the sea, and that means that much of its identity is in relationship to the land. And the population is still largely dispersed all over the land. It has, with the exception of Charlotte, which is just a little over 1 million, it has no really large cities. It has lots of smaller cities and towns, but no really large cities. And if you talk to a North Carolinian, they regularly tell you what county they grew up in. Not what town, but what county, which actually drives you crazy as a newcomer. I'm like, really? I don't know where Surrey County is. Tell me a name that I can find on a map. But they identify themselves by their counties. It's fascinating. Just because it's the land. It's where they live. It's the land. Wake Forest is in a very particular part of North Carolina. It was in part of Winston-Salem is a hyphenated city. So much like you all know about bringing multiple nouns together. Winston-Salem also brings multiple nouns together. Winston was Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. And Salem was settled by German-speaking immigrants who followed the valley south from Pennsylvania, from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after they came over from Europe, through the Virginia mountains. The Moravians who founded Old Salem looked for land on top of a hill. But interestingly, instead of building their city on top of the hill, they designed their city halfway down the hill to use gravity and natural water power to operate their water systems. Right? So these were people who, from the very beginning, read their land, figured out what the place could do. Yeah, they're not on the hill. They left that to the cigarette manufacturers later. They were built on the way down the hill, so they would have natural water. And we still actually, I live in Old Salem, in a house that was built in 1831. And there's the old town pump is still there and still bringing water from the water system. They surveyed the trees And, importantly, they selected only the trees to cut that they needed for construction. They did not go crazy cutting trees. Long before any modern conservation ordinance, they required a landowner to get written permission to cut a tree down. All right, that was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. From its very beginning, where I live, Winston-Salem was birthed by living in harmony with the land. North Carolina is also an agricultural state and an agricultural-based industry state. It was, given its terrain, never a full-blown plantation state like the rest of the cotton belt of the Deep South, but be that as it may not have been a full-blown plantation state, it nonetheless utilized an enslaved population to make money off the land. So not all of the story of the land is a joyous one. And that story is also listening to your place and listening to the land. Tobacco, wood for furniture, water power for textiles and shoes, poultry, farming, pottery. This state's life was tied to its land. And again, think of your place, think of this place, and think of what you can supply. When the economic formula shifted, and you would know that well here, so that large-scale profit trumped smaller-scale, locally based production, the agricultural identity of North Carolina was laid bare. Up and down this state, and I-40 runs the length from you can actually drive on one highway from the mountains. So it depends on if you're doing stage right or stage left. But anyway, mountains to seas, west to east. Up and down the highway lies beautiful land, to a great extent still fertile land. But its land-based economy has left the land and its people behind. I mean, think what I said, textile, wood, shoes. It's not there anymore, furniture. Tobacco, for a different reason, is not there anymore. Again, not all the use of the land is a happy story. And that's also part of not romanticizing, thinking about the land. All right? So it's important not to think it. It's important to think about, when we think about land and garden, it's equally important to think about labor as it is to think about the soil and the fruit. That all of them come together. And it's all a piece, it's a human story from beginning to end, in the middle, and we just have to think about all of those pieces. Who was the labor? So, what might it mean, then, to think about educating for ministry, doing ministry, being a minister, thinking about it, in a place shaped by its land, and in a place, if we come to know, whose promises and whose problems are also shaped by the land and by its place. Right? So that it's not an add-on, it's everything. How can we educate religious leaders and be religious leaders so that we live in faith? We live faith in partnership with our place. So that we know, somehow, that we are all part of the larger creation. And that human flourishing is only possible when the place flourishes as well. How can we do that? How can we do that? Now I'm going to tell, so that's North Carolina as a case study. I'm going to say a little bit about where these convictions led me, and my institution, and then think again more broadly. At Wake Forest School of Divinity, we're beginning to answer that question in several different ways. And one example that I will highlight for the moment is an initiative that we have that's entitled the Food, Faith, and Religious Leadership Initiative. Those are the 5 words. Down here I just have written FFRLI, but if I said that to you, you'd have no idea what I was talking about. Food, Faith, and Religious Leadership. This initiative was our first kind of curricular entry point to a comprehensive approach to sustainability and care of creation. And I'm going to read you the purpose statement of the initiative so that you can see where it's about something broader than just what our school is doing. And it begins with a gerund. I didn't necessarily write it, but if you're listening, it begins with a gerund. Renewing theological education for the 21st century, I'm happy to say, comma. It's not a dangling one, it's here. Renewing theological education for the 21st century, we equip religious leaders with the knowledge, skills, and pastoral habits necessary to guide congregations and other faith-based organizations into creating more redemptive food systems, where God's peace, shalom, becomes visible for a hungry world. That's the mission statement of the initiative. You see some specificity around food, redemptive food systems, but you also see a claim that this specificity can renew theological education for our day. Right now, sure, this is the larger-than-life rhetoric that all vision and mission statements have to have. All right, I will grant you that. However, the rhetoric of this claim also states a real conviction and need, that the old models for theological education are reaching their endpoints. They are reaching their endpoints not simply because of financial and economic challenges to existing models, although in some conversations you often think that's the only reason that any change is needed, is that you go to a meeting and all you hear about is financial challenges. But because the world in which we educate and live as a church has changed. Now, is it more changed than at other points in its history? I don't know, and I doubt it. But the reason that you can say it has changed is now we know it has. And now we have different voices in the conversation that remind us of what the picture is, or what the picture needs to be. The experience of students, especially those under 30, is vastly different from the experience on which most of our educational models are based. Our models, by and large, educational models, I would say up until, well, probably still now, but there is some shift. But by and large, our educational models are based on knowing as the ultimate goal. What do you know? What do you know? That's the ultimate goal. And for students under 30, their information-saturated experience leads them to place doing and being closer to the center of ultimate meaning than knowing. They don't, this is anathema to most faculty members, but they don't need us for the acquisition of knowledge. Because they can find any fact I have to say someplace else, right? And I mean, they can look it up. So to actually acquire the dates of the kings or when the books of the New Testament were written or any, you name it, they don't need me for that. They do need me, I'm happy to say, but they don't need me for that. Because they need me to correct that. They need me to put that in a context. They need me, but they have such ready access to stuff that we used to have to go to the library to look up. And they will find it in the middle of class. Like you'll say, that book was written, and all of a sudden somebody will say, 1968, published by. I'm like, how did you know that? Because they Googled it while I was talking. So that means that just a simple acquisition, building facts is not what it's about. Now, what do you do with it? Who are you because of it? How do we shape knowledge? How do we interpret it? How do we critically engage it? That they need us for.
Right.
That they need us for. Where some of you are students, you can correct me later, but right now he's going to live in fantasy. This is what faculty is still important for. So when this initiative says that we want to renew theological education for the 21st century, what that statement is wagering on is that an approach to educating for ministry that takes students outside of an information-centric experience, and you still need information, but that takes you outside of an information-centric experience and starts with an approach that by necessity integrates knowing, being, and doing. All right, that doesn't think they're still separate, can seed, pun intended, the renewal of what we're about, both of educating for ministry and of ministry itself. How? Here are some of the, we have some specific goals One is to create courses, equip students with knowledge, develop research, build partnerships with the community. So that's one of the ways. Most schools can't do this on your own without having partnerships. But here's the final goal. Teach and cultivate the theological habit that living in peace with the land and with non-human creation is a core pastoral practice for religious leaders and the communities with whom they serve. Living with the land and non-human creatures is a core pastoral practice, not an add-on, but a core pastoral practice like preaching, pastoral care, worship, administration. At the heart of what it means to be a pastor, a religious leader, is understanding what it really means when we often talk about stewardship, but stewardship tends to only mean Stewardship Sunday and how are you going to make your budget for the church year. If we really reclaim the word stewardship in this context, that's the core pastoral practice. What it means to be a pastor is to have this theological habit that living in peace with the land is essential to your identity as a religious leader. So that religious leadership becomes, by definition, a practice of care for creation. A practice that embodies that we are all, animal, vegetable, mineral, in this together. So having done this for us, the initiative has a wide variety of dimensions. We have continuing education dimensions to it, and it's actually in our MDiv curriculum. So that we have a concentration, but what's interesting about it is that the concentration is like a specialization inside the MDiv. But what's really interesting about that is that it has spread well beyond the people who actually take those classes. So it has infused the entire ethos of the institution, and we link it under the overarching rubric is well-being and religious leadership. And so at the moment we have two things that we kind of focus on and specialize on in those two. One is the food and faith, and the other is faith and the health of the public. So that we partner with the hospital and do a lot of things with what's religious leadership doing for community health. Out of the stuff, some stuff we read for us. We also have, for 1 year, a faculty reading group, and we just read books on food. Some that were from food industry people, some that were theological perspectives. We met in one another's homes. We ate really good local food together, because there's one great caterer in Winston-Salem who did it all, because we had a little grant to pay for this. And we discovered that reading books together about food was not simply reading books together about food. They weren't really about food, but provided a new lens to think about the incarnation. The incarnation, the Word become flesh, is by definition place-specific, place-based theology. That's what the incarnation is about. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Notice, came to our place. A theological starting point that calls us to value the particular as our access to the universal. Not the other way around, but the particular first as an expression of the universal. Not, as much of our tendency often has been, to start with the universal and think it fits all. No, to say each particular expression is what creates the universal. Beginning with the incarnation, thinking about food and creation as an access point to the incarnation also invites us to see the holy in the everyday. And it reminds us that the bread and wine were first wheat and grapes. They really were, wheat and grapes. And that the seeds planted and the vines tended also belong to the body of Christ. And so I'm going to stop there for a second, and now, since I'm a New Testament scholar, we're going to talk about the Bible for a little bit and show how that's the case. Because if you think about it, that's it. And where this is extraordinarily useful for me, for thinking about it as a form of practical theology, is that once we started this initiative, I started to see things completely differently and saw this both, I mean, I was just place-based, interested, but saw the way in which creation and food, agriculture, place, creation, actually are at the heart of Christian tradition, but we tend to run roughshod over them, thinking, well, they're just actually, oh, that's just a symbol. No, actually, it isn't just a symbol. It was the common core of shared experience. And once you start seeing it, it's just everywhere. So I'm going to just do a few examples from the New Testament, because that's what I have, New Testament. Use of garden and gardening language in the New Testament, you find it in two different ways, and it's fascinating. You find it in Jesus' teaching, and that's the way we most often first think about it. Jesus taught about. So for that, I'm going to look at a little bit from the Gospel of Mark. But perhaps more importantly, and something that I'm actually want to continue to work on more, is Jesus' identity is also shaped by this. So Jesus teaches, so it's the content of what Jesus says, but it's actually also how Jesus' identity is defined and presented. And for that, we're going to look at the Gospel of John. All right, so we'll do a little bit of time in Mark, and then we'll look at John. With a few exceptions, most of the imagery about that most of the garden imagery, and it's something that's kind of important to remember. In Jesus' teaching, which is where I'll start, so in Mark. Okay, think about it. When you teach, you try to use language that you think your students will understand. So that means, as common as garden and agricultural language is in the New Testament, that was the common currency for Jesus' hearers in the New Testament and for the readers in the first century. It means that by using gardening language and imagery as teaching language, both Jesus and the evangelists assumed it evoked a common experience that could then become the basis for teaching. Gardening language is also amazingly active. It's about sowing and reaping. And it has a tangible, recognizable yield known as fruit. And it's rarely, interestingly, there are rarely in the New Testament, there are more in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, there aren't that many actual gardening scenes. It's by and large metaphorical language. One of the few actual gardening scenes is the disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath. That's one of the few times in the New Testament where we actually see anybody pick or plant anything. But we get talked to about picking and planting a lot. So it's not an agricultural guide. The focus is on how gardening images can help us see the world differently. How can the languages and images that we know from our common experience open up the kingdom of God and God differently by taking what we know and having it be what we don't know. And also, this is also very important, gardening imagery is always communal. It's evocative of the kingdom of God or the community of disciples. It rarely, if ever, describes the individual. It's not my soil, but our soil. And it's also both language of possibility and language of discernment and judgment. And in many ways, I think you can tell how far in reading some of this language we have come from understanding agriculture, that parables that use language of weeding and pruning freak us out, as if they're horrible. Well, good luck if you don't weed and prune. And so weeding and pruning is also the activity of a rich spiritual life. But what happens is we tend to think, oh, it's about weeding and pruning them. Not that it's about weeding and pruning me. Or us. And so we back away completely from language of discernment and judgment or either you rush into it, so you're kind of a discernment and judgment focused theological tradition, or you back away from it because you don't want to be a discernment and judgment focused theological tradition. But discernment and judgment is actually really kind of important, because without weeding and pruning, how can that which needs to flourish flourish? How can you understand the difference between, a healthy vine and an unhealthy vine if we don't prune? But we tend to think it's about somebody else, and so we back away from that language, when it's actually, if we were close to the garden, we'd know, oh yeah, I go out and prune all the time. And I don't feel a pang of guilt when I cut off that dead vine. I just think, oh, thank goodness, look, now this one can grow. But it's because we project it instead of thinking that, we tend to objectify judgment instead of subjectifying it. The heaviest concentration in Mark, and I just want to look quickly at Mark 4. I already did the parable of the sower this morning, so I won't, how many people were not in chapel? I'm not like outing or anything. I'm just trying to figure out. It wasn't for that reason. I was just trying to figure out how much I have to repeat. I'll give you in a nutshell the parable of the sower. The parables in Mark 4, and this is what's so interesting about these parables. The parables in Mark 4 are all agricultural parables, and they are the very first time Jesus speaks publicly in the Gospel of Mark. He's spoken to his disciples, but this is his first public teaching. And so in Mark 1-3, Mark has established Jesus as a miracle worker and as a source of controversy. All right, so he's a miracle worker and he's controversial. And he's taught to the disciples and the Pharisees, but he has not taught to a very large crowd until this unit actually begins in a way at 32. You all know that chapters are the very worst thing, that they were, I'd say they were a tool of the devil, but that would sound horrible as a Bible person. But I had a teacher in graduate school who said Stephen Langton is one of the people who was responsible for it, and that you could tell that he must have been riding on horseback and just dropped his pencil down wherever he felt like. When the horse bumped, then his pencil came down. And that's how we got our chapter divisions, because often a unit is interrupted by a big chapter number, and we don't know how to read the story completely all the way through. So one of the most important things, if you're still a student, or anybody can learn, but I'm just talking about the students who are here, one of the most important things you can learn from your New Testament class is ignore the chapter and verse divisions. All right? Read for sense units, but don't let those big numbers make you think, because they just divide it up in really screwy ways. So Jesus talks to a crowd and then talks to them secondly. But this is the first time in Mark 4. So we've had a lot of the gospel that hasn't spoken publicly. And if you actually start with the part that precedes this, the question that they ask Jesus is, who is your family? That leads into these agricultural parables. And his answer is, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. And then he tells the agricultural parables to introduce what's the real answer to the will of God. I'm going to tell you in all these parables. It's to help grow the kingdom. That's the answer that he gives. That's the will of God, is to help grow the kingdom. And also, Jesus has not been referred to as teacher yet. But after these parables, for the first time, the disciples in Mark will call Jesus teacher. So these are very important parables in the sense of establishing Jesus' identity and what Jesus' ministry and mission is about in the Gospel of Mark. The parable of the sower, briefly, is that it's really exactly that, the parable of the sower, not the seed, and not the soil. So if you want to remember anything about that parable, it's the parable of the sower. Jesus starts by saying, listen, a sower went out to sow. And one of the main things that we do in messing up this particular parable is make it be about the soil, so that we focus on all the things that won't happen, instead of the possibility that happens. Think of this is Jesus' first parable, and it begins by saying, a sower went out to sow. And he sowed as broadly as you can sow, and we always forget this, it ended up with 100-fold yield. Okay, any of you who do have an agricultural background, you get 100-fold pretty darn happy. So this is not a parable that has a bad ending about this method of sowing, but we act as if it does most of the time. You can also find a very similar, Paul in 2 Corinthians 9 has a very similar teaching, where Paul will say, the point is this is 2 Corinthians 9:6. The point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. I mean, that's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 9:6, and it's very much the same. That's essentially the parable of the sower. Sow bountifully, you'll reap bountifully. Sow sparingly, that's what's going to happen. Now, Mark 4:26 to 28, which is often called, this is crazy, this is often called, another thing to know is, you know the little headings that are at the top of your Bible? Ignore those two. Okay, just ignore those two. Because those are somebody's idea of what the most important thing is. And it may not be what the most important thing is. And you could be going down a lot of rabbit holes because you followed the heading at the top of the page instead of actually reading the passage. They are good for helping you thumb your way through your Bible, though. I will say that. They do help you a lot with that. This one is often called the seed growing by itself, in which I want to say, how else does a seed grow? This is the parable. The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day. The seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. When the grain is ripe, at once the sower goes in with the sickle because the harvest has come. Right? That's often called the seed growing by itself or the seed growing in secret. But that actually, as I said, shows you how far away our interpretations are from gardening, because every seed grows by itself. And this parable is often read as a parable of the final judgment, because it has the word the sickle in it. And Matthew has a parable about wheat and weeds, but that's not this parable. All right, these interpretations miss the garden imagery. So I want to pay attention just to think about two things in this parable. First, the sower and the seed. All right, the sower scatters seed. So I think we just had the sower went out to sow right before this, which is the normal thing to do. He's very active. And then what does he do? He sleeps and rises night and day. I've read in many commentaries, this is an example of his passivity. He does nothing. I'm kind of like, what do most of us do? We sleep and rise every day. So this is not a mark of passivity. It's a mark of the passage of time. How do we tell time? We sleep and we rise every day. All right, so in a storytelling mode, you're not going to say, and then 8 weeks passed. You're going to say, he slept and he rose every day. He slept and he rose every day. And what happens? The seed sprouts and it grows. But he doesn't know how. Interestingly, this is great for any feminist theology class that might be happening this semester. There's one, right? Yeah. I knew that. I was just saying if you're listening. It says in verse 28, the earth produces of itself. And it's very interesting because it is the Greek word Gaia. So it really says, hey Gaia, as if the earth goddess causes this to grow. It's one of the few places actually in the New Testament where Gaia is the subject, is the verb. I mean, is the subject, and then followed by an active verb. So, yes. So the earth causes it to grow. And the sower does what he's supposed to do, harvest. So, is this about judgment? Maybe, except for how else do you harvest but bring in the sickle? But more than likely, this is a parable of the kingdom. How is it a parable of the kingdom? And how do we then think about gardening, caring for creation? It is, again, it really is the flip side of the parable of the sower. If the seed had not been sown, there would be no harvest. So the two of them go together. The first one is from the sower's perspective, and the second is from the seed's perspective. So this is what the sower does, this is what the seed does. And in the kingdom, they're both going to work together. And then, finally, Mark 4:30 to 32, my favorite, in Mark, which is the mustard seed. With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable shall we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth, yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can, listen to this carefully, can make nests in its shade. Now, if you would go ahead and, if you Google mustard seed, okay, I might shatter some assumptions for you here, sorry. If you Google mustard seed, what you're going to do is find all these pictures of mustard trees, right? Okay, there really is no such thing as a mustard tree. And let's read carefully what Mark and Jesus actually says. All right, in Mark, not Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke talk about it, the mustard seed becoming a tree, because it says that the birds nest in its branches. Okay? Mark says the birds of the air make nests in its shade. It's a huge difference in the way the story is told. In Mark, the surprise of this parable, the solution of as a riddle, you can tell it, if you tell this like a riddle. Did I tell you the one about the mustard seed? And that's really the way to think about parables, actually, is kind of that form. The mustard seed grows into a mustard plant, which is what one thinks a mustard seed would do. So that can't be the surprise. What's this about? He's still setting up the riddle when it tells you that it grows. What's the setup? The setup is, have you heard the one about the kingdom of God and the mustard seed? The seed is sown, it grows to its full size, the greatest of all the herbs, because the mustard seed was very important in antiquity. It was very powerful for healing. If you go back and read Chinese literature, it's one of the most ancient known herbs. So everybody would know about the mustard seed and with the power of it. But the surprise of it is that the birds of heaven are able to dwell in its shade, not in its branches, but that even something as insignificant as a mustard plant creates a sufficiency of shade. So when you're looking at the big things around you and looking for shade and shelter, don't step over the mustard seed and don't step over the mustard plant. Because even a mustard plant provides dwelling and shelter for the birds that fly by. Birds looking for respite, birds looking for renewal, to get out of the sun. They're not making nests. They're actually finding, you don't nest in the shade. All right, they are nesting, and then they're flying on. They're not dwelling in its branches. They're nesting in the shade. And the gift of the mustard seed is not necessarily that it provides permanent shelter for the bird families that get to it first, and then can call squatters' rights or landowners' rights on the branches. But the gift of the mustard seed and the mustard plant is that it's shade for any bird that comes to it. All right? Because the kingdom of God is a resting place. And maybe not a nesting place, but a resting place. So think about the kingdom. If you think about how do we care for creation, we sow the seeds, we let it grow, and we trust the shade. Right? That even a mustard plant has enough shade. Even the smallest. It's not just the Lebanons of cedar. I mean, the cedars of Lebanon. Sorry for flipping that. It is also the mustard seed. Now, let me switch to John for a sec and talk about Jesus' identity. If you have a Bible, go to John 1. You know this, what I'm about to say to you, but I'm going to say it in a way that you maybe put it in this context. How does the Gospel of John begin? Thank you. And what you probably also know is that the books of the Greek versions of the Old Testament, so it's complicated to call them the Greek Hebrew Scriptures because that's very unusual to try to say that. So the Septuagint, the names of the books of the Bible in the Greek Bible were the first words of the Bible. So that when you are the hearer of the Gospel of John, and you hear in the beginning, for a moment, you don't know if it's Genesis or if it's John. I mean, you honestly do not know. And so that John, the evangelist, is doing two things here. He is obviously taking you into the Genesis story by in the beginning. But he's also, with a little bit of a nod and a wink, saying, okay, I'm telling you a creation story too. This is also a creation story. This is a creation story. Because in the beginning. And then, as the prologue unfolds, the first thing you get is a story of creation. So you actually get creation in the prologue. And then, as the rest of chapter 1 unfolds, it is, you may or may not have ever noticed this, it's punctuated by references to days. So you have something that happens on John 1:19, that's the first day, it doesn't tell you that. But then at John 1:29 it says the next day. And then at John 1:35 it says the next day. And then at John 1:43 it says the next day. And then at John 2, the wedding at Cana, it says on the third day. All right, do the math. 4 plus 3, 7. Right? We have just gone through the 7 days of creation to end us on the Sabbath at the wedding at Cana. So the day in which God rested and saw that it was good is the miracle at the wedding at Cana. Which is, this is the only gospel in which it occurs, the miracle of the wedding at Cana. And it's also a miracle that, unlike a healing miracle, this is a miracle that didn't have to happen. All right? No one needed this wine. Okay, the host needed a little bit because he'd be shamed by his friends that he'd been such a skinflint that he hadn't quite spent enough money. You know, he'd be a little shamed in an honor-shame system. But no one needed this. Nothing was at stake in this miracle. So what kind of miracle is it? It's a miracle of the Sabbath abundance. That this miracle says, and it was very good. Because notice, the steward actually says, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. So this miracle is pronounced as good, just the way the Sabbath is pronounced as good. So this is the story begins. This is the story of a new creation. It starts with in the beginning, and so Jesus is the author. God through Jesus is the author of a new creation. Then let's think about John 20, where we just were. It's Easter. If you think about John 20, it's the only it's the only place where this takes place. Where are the resurrection appearances? In the garden. In the garden. Why? Because Jesus is the gardener. Yep. So the new creation and the garden motif, God through Jesus is the new creation, and Jesus is the gardener. So that the intrinsic connection between creation and place, and Christian identity, and Christian formation, and Christian acts, has been there to be a Johannine scholar from the beginning. I mean, and it's been there. And so that it is, and there is a play on Genesis 2:8. There's a play on Genesis, and it carries all the way through. Interestingly, also, in the I am statements for Jesus' identity in John, what is he? I am the bread. I am the vine. So there is this organic, intrinsic connection to the particular, to place, to land. And it's there, and it's just really important. So out of this, now let's think to some more practical theological pieces of it again. Once we at Wake Forest started these conversations about food and faith and sustainability, it's taken hold like crazy. So I have a New Testament faculty member who taught a class on 1 Corinthians, in which a symposium meal modeled on those in antiquity was one of the class's final projects. Because that's where stuff The liturgy professor began her sacraments class, and she's repeating it this fall, and she took her sacraments class, sacraments and ordinances, because we have some Baptist students who now recognize the word sacraments, so we teach sacraments and ordinances. She began her sacraments class next to a stream in the inner city park. That's where they went. To see what water is like in Winston-Salem. And also took the class to the water treatment plant to give them a place-based view of the waters of baptism. And particularly if you are an immersion baptism tradition, understanding that about the waters of baptism really makes a difference because you are really in the water. She also had each class member bake a loaf of bread as a homework assignment. And then they brought it to class, and it was fascinating after the things the students did. Like this one guy in the class, his grandfather has this sourdough that's been going for generations. And he went to his grandfather's and made the bread with his grandfather's sourdough starter and brought that to class. Because why? That is the incarnation. That is the Word made flesh. We have students, we've partnered with a Jewish agricultural farm and fellowship program in Connecticut, and the students they go there and immerse themselves in Jewish environmental theology and worship practices. Again, to think of the way it's an identity of it. And another faculty member, it's just kind of how it's taken off. He's writing his second book, and I know he wouldn't have done it if we hadn't started this project, on foodways, culinary culture in the Black church. And it's going to be published by UNC, I think, and teaches a class on that subject. Because once you start, it's everywhere. The thread is just everywhere. And so it becomes a way of thinking about what does it mean? So that you look around and you notice that, some people actually can't get to a grocery store. There is no grocery store in your neighborhood. And so once you start thinking about this, it's also the migrant and immigrant labor force who work the land. Do they have health insurance? How much do they earn? Where do they live? What's sexual harassment like in the workplace? What's it like for kids in the tobacco field? What's going on? And it helps us, thinking about the land, helps us think anew about who our neighbor is. Right? How do market economies work? What's the integration of food and public health? And again, here's the family piece. It is probably, paying attention to creation is probably the most intergenerational ministry that you could possibly have. Because it's not, no one is patronizing any other member of the intergenerational cohort. But everyone has something to contribute out of their own place and their own time. And how can congregations lead in public questions about protecting the fullness of creation for now and for the future? And how does our dominant cultural value of more work, more possessions, more power, work against the values of a good creation? And it just goes on and on and on. And we also then need to continually return to our vocations as theological educators, as religious leaders, and continue to imagine what the future of religious leadership will look like if we are all shaped by education in place. If we exercise a gentleness towards all that is living. If we are serious that the theological habit that living in peace with the land and non-human creation is a core pastoral practice, then my hunch is we'll find the way to move from a technical focus on knowledge to an integration of being, knowing, doing. It is both our spiritual disciplines and practices for ministry. If you pay attention to different kind of spiritual disciplines that come out of this, you find that you attend to things like preparation, cultivation, anticipation, waiting, beauty, for the sake of beauty, not for the sake of being commodified to something else. And you see produce and fruit as the result of all of that. And again, itself, not simply a commodity. So that I would suggest that care for creation must move from avocation to the heart of our vocation. That it needs to be at the heart of who we are and what we do. Not the fun add-on, not the popular club or the extracurricular activity, but the heart of how we understand our identity as religious leaders. At the heart of a theological education enterprise, and I would also suggest at the heart of a ministry enterprise. This should not be a radical statement, but somehow it often is, because as educators, we are often so enculturated by thinking in our discipline-centered models that most of us were educated to think in, that we're afraid to move outside the boundaries. But instead, I would say this is who we are because creation does not have time to wait while we decide if we can risk something new in ministry, in education, in our pastoral practices. There is not time to wait. We just had Sally Bingham on campus last week, on Interfaith Power and Light. And one of the things she said that was most sobering, but one is that this is the last generation that has a chance to fix it, is what many of the scientists will now say. So you can see it coming, but we also are in the position to fix it, to try to do something about what's happening to creation. Care of creation begins with the local, tending the place we inhabit. And so that when you often feel like, oh, I can't do anything, I can't make a difference, yeah, you can. Tend to the local. It really does make a difference, small as it is, to recycle. I mean, all those little things that seem like nothing, tend the local. Tend it. So creation begins in the local, but each of God's creatures, human and non-human, inhabit their own local. So my local overlaps with your local. And suddenly all of creation is my place, if you start with the local. And if I'm open to your local, then all of a sudden we're more. Our work, our primary work, is to keep creation as good as when God first entrusted it to our care. So it doesn't really matter what you call what's happening, or how you want to say what causes it. Our job as religious leaders is to keep creation as good as when God first entrusted it to our care. It was a great gift that God gave us. And kind of every day we should kind of think that we're holding it up and saying, how are we doing? To God. So this is, I would suggest, the defining mark, the defining mark of a religious leader. To know that creation work entrusted to us is always an act of grace. That God gave us a gift, and that we are acting in giftedness back. That this is an act of grace. The creation entrusted to us was a gift, and our creation work is responding in grace to the gift of grace that God gave us. Creation work also puts us into the balance of being, doing, and knowing. So, the goodness of God's creation summons us to fresh responsibilities. But the goodness of God's creation also will surprise us with beauty and joy every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Day. I know that Dr. O'Day is willing to entertain your questions, and we'll invite you to speak from where you are, and she will paraphrase if you look like you didn't hear the question.
Does anybody have anything? Don't have to. Yes.
Thank you very much. I remember assigning one of your books to the course on the Gospel of John.
Uh-huh.
What but I retired 20 years ago, so that means it was before that. But I just wanted to...
I'm hoping it was my dissertation, but go on.
I wanted to see you in person.
Well, thank you.
My question is this. We had another lecturer here earlier, and her lecture ended on what she called the evolutionary power of love.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to ask you, in terms of the Gospel of John, the synoptics don't say much about love.
No.
2 times. The love language is used 40 times in John.
Yes.
How does love language figure into then the way you have unfolded?
Yes, thank you. Can everybody, the gist of his question is, I don't know if you can hear it way over on that side, and so could you hear it?
Yes.
No. Okay, well, excellent projection.
I've been working on it.
I know, I'm impressed. It's a really good question, and it's about the nature of the Gospel of John. So I'm going to say something about John. That in the Gospel of John, when you talk about the incarnation, I mean, the Gospel of John, in all books of the New Testament, takes the incarnation, that's the center. So that's the basis of everything, is the incarnation in the Gospel of John. And what's the reason for the incarnation? That God loves the world. So not people, limitedly, but the cosmos. So that when you see Jesus, you are seeing the love of God for the world incarnate. So in one way that it fits is that God's love for the world was not limited. And then God's love for the world is made flesh and lives in the world through Jesus. Now, I could go on for a long time this afternoon about love in the Gospel of John. But one of the things that's important, particularly I guess as we're here in the first week after Easter, is that it is actually that John runs a slightly different narrative. Both you've noticed it around just the presence of the vocabulary of love. But John also runs a different narrative about what is the saving purpose of Christ's life and death. And for John, the saving purpose of Christ's life and death is the full embodiment and expression of the love of God. And that's what you see in the life, and that's also what you see when in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes quite explicit that no one takes his life from him, but he lays it down of his own accord. He makes that quite explicit. And so the whole thing is about that. And I haven't yet figured out how to connect it as much to the Genesis stuff, but it's something I'm working on and would like to keep working on. John's language for love is, now I'm going to contradict Nygren completely, those of you who were who were raised up on, all that eros and phileo and agape, wrong, it's all wrong. Because the Gospel of John and Jesus use both phileo and agapao interchangeably and as synonyms. God does both, people do both, Jesus does both. And so the Gospel of John really is, it's the language of love is a language of friendship. And so I think one of the ways that you could think about stretching it is it's clear the model of unlimited human love that Jesus exemplifies. And one wonders if it's also possible then to think about, okay, well, if you're a friend to one another, you're also a friend to creation. And if love can also be worded, that way. Since you see new creation, and so much of that imagery, and at the end, in chapter 20, when Jesus breathes on the disciples to again be the spirit of creation. So, anyway, it's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That brings up a question for me, because I think one of the most abused proof textings is John 3:16. And it's used as guilt and shame in many, unfortunately. And a lot of us have to address that.
Right, and I'll just say it to you out loud. It says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, blah, blah. But, so I don't have it in front of me, I'll look at it. Why should I paraphrase when I have a Bible right in front of me? It's also a place where English does a really bad translation. So I'll just tell you something about where most English translations make this more difficult. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, so whoever believes in him may not perish but may have eternal life. Okay, it has the second part. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. And so they actually go together. They're one sentence. When it says indeed, it's a connective in Greek. They're part of one thought. And also it doesn't say condemn, it just says judge. And that's actually a really important theme for the Gospel of John, because Jesus is judge and is not judge, because Jesus doesn't come to judge, but our response is judgment itself. But the fact that the NRSV chooses to translate it as condemn, when the same verb used other places in John is only translated as judge, just shows the kind of the impact of tradition and use on how it gets translated. But anytime you have 3:16, you just need to pair it with 17, and then you have a conversation. But it's how I know I'm getting old too, though, because I will say to my students, "Oh, remember that guy at the football game?" And they all just look at me. Because he's not there anymore. No clown wig, nothing. I'm like, really? So that's when I just think, okay, I got to give that example up. So, okay. Somebody up in the back did you have a question?
Me?
Yeah. Did you have your hand up earlier?
No, I was holding your book up.
Oh, somebody had a question. Okay, you have a question?
Yes. My first point is, have you ever seen a mustard seed?
Have I ever seen one? Yeah.
Have you ever seen the result from sowing one?
Uh-huh.
What does it look like?
It looks like a big old herb.
Yeah?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And next thing, meeting in the incarnation in the garden.
Uh-huh.
Where is the garden?
It's the earth.
Okay.
So more generally, not a specific garden, but just the garden as the representative of the garden is a small sample, is a small way of saying in creation. So we probably could have said creation. What?
How does we meet there?
How? Because in the very particulars of it. So that by recognizing, I would say, and that in some ways, in many different ways, by actually slowing down in some ways to see what the particular is, noticing the particular, noticing the fullness of the gift of creation, noticing how how linked we are to what happens to the soil. And again, if you actually go all the way back, if you think how we are made in the Genesis story, we were formed from the earth. So in the way of the Genesis stories of creation, one way of kind of meeting the incarnation in the garden is remembering those stories of origin and how those stories of origin actually have a theological framework that shapes who we are and how we're related to God. If you think of Ash Wednesday, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. This is where it's where we are, no pun intended, it's where we are rooted. It is where we grew up from. It's really interesting. The one in the healing miracles in the Gospel of John, the way that Jesus heals. First one, he makes in chapter 9, he makes mud. So you actually get even in there the action of the recreation, that the new man is made in John 9 by molding mud and spit, just as the Adam was, the same thing. So all those ways is the ways in which we meet it.
We don't make from dirt.
No, but we are, our theology, our theological narrative tells us that whether it is our actual biological origins are not the same thing as what our theology tells us is the way our identity is shaped. And so our stories are shaping our identity, and our stories tell us that that's how we need to understand who we are. And so that's how, and so that frames us. It's in our stories. So it's my actual DNA is not that critical for this, for our theological stories. But it's the theological stories that make a difference.
Dr. O'Day, you had me at the gerund and the comma. My students will testify to that. But my question is, it's become increasingly more important and profound to me. The little window I thought I was seeing by itself in Paul, in Romans 8, about the whole creation groaning, awaiting redemption. And I wonder if you see in John the redemption of all creation, not just of people implied by
I think
all.
that's the cosmos needs that.
Nice.
And think of I am the bread. It's that for John in particular, in many ways, the Christological images are so universal and so linked to the natural world. And it's funny to me, I was always super resistant to thinking that the Gospel and the Book of Revelation had any kind of common, even history of authorship or the same community, but I actually, the more and more I work with both of them, the more I think they're not so far apart. In the sense of, and that's where you actually see the cosmic redemption.
So we should be
Because what you have to
teaching-
remember on that one is that the new heaven and the new earth come down. Not that we go up, but that the new heaven and new earth come down.
So we should be teaching and preaching that in the church.
Yeah.
Not just people.
Yeah,
waiting to
yes,
be-
and it's a really interesting thing. That's one of the things that Interfaith Power and Light and Green Faith really push on, is that we often abdicate our responsibility about talking about creation and only talk about people. And people can't flourish without creation. So even if you want to be super anthrocentric, you still ought to be creation-centric, because you can't save people without saving creation. Because humans can't flourish if creation doesn't flourish. So even if that's really what you want to say, is you want to be really anthropocentric in the way you define stuff, a necessary corollary is going to be creation. Because humans can't flourish if the place where they live isn't flourishing. So it kind of goes
Back to place.
Yeah, well, but it's that's how human flourishing is defined.
I've moved around a lot, serving the Presbyterian Church USA, and my first move was from Princeton to Memphis.
Three different places.
Hi. This is one of my supervisors in Memphis. We've aged it. Speak for yourself. I've aged it. When I got to Memphis, having to figure out that whole place, really, I existentially needed to do what you're describing.
Yeah,
And
it's a good example of those two.
The city of Memphis is one thing, but to go out to people's home places was really important. And I think one of my seminal adventures was taking our older adults to Shiloh, to the battlefield. If you want to understand a place, go to the places where people have experienced defeat. So get to Shiloh. All my people are in nice, neat rows in the National Cemetery, and all of our members' people were in the burial valleys. And I still have chills when I think about it. So that really convinced me, as I moved from place to place, of the need to really be immersed in the place to begin to understand. And how can you preach if you don't understand? So it's been kind of a lifelong adventure for me. People ask me, after all of this, what is it to be in Western New York? And I say, I've moved to Eden. And it's true. Man, this is Eden.
3 years, lush.
But then as a trustee of this seminary, divinity school, to think about, well, then what does that mean in terms of what we're doing here? What is it to be a seminary embedded, rooted in Eden? Fascinating. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I got one down here.
I was really touched by your talking about the mustard seed. And I began to think, as a person who's been a social advocate all my ministry, which is now 50 years, I thought both directions. I thought, I think the church is too often nesting and not on the wing, not I'm not just looking for shelter or shade for occasional respites. And also, who might we encounter in the shade? And I particularly think of the most vulnerable in our society, particularly the immigrants who don't find much shade in the desert of Arizona. It was just very touching for me, and I just wanted to share with you from my perspective where my mind went as you were describing that.
We're going to have one more comment from a student of J.C. Wynn's.
There was inadvertently, or at least unknowingly, there were some things that you said that reminded me of a conversation with J.C. Wynn, so I just wanted to share that as being in this place. The room didn't look like this then, to say the least. I had an experience of coming here as a Southern Baptist, and I was doing a year's internship. I'd had him the first semester. I decided to take a couple more classes and ended up finishing, but all of a sudden I found myself a pastor, which I hadn't intended on doing. And the first call I got from a parishioner was over in our wing, which is the psychiatric wing, and I didn't know that at the time. But when I found out, before I went to the hospital, I stopped by J.C. Wynn's office. And I said, "What do I do? I don't feel like a pastor yet." And he shared that when he was a father, he didn't feel like a father until he started changing diapers and acting like a father. And so I was thinking about your emphasis on being and doing as leading to knowing. And I said, "Well, what do I do first?" And he said, "Go and listen."
Nice. It's a great story. A great story. Thanks.
Could I ask one more question?
How about out in the hall while Gail is...
This is a crucial question. I think might be helpful for everybody. Because the toughest text in John is, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me." But your emphasis upon incarnation means that the real issue here is not our way to God, but overwhelmingly God's way to us. And therefore that text from John 14 really needs to be understood. He is not the exclusive way to God, he is God's way to us and to the whole world. So it's not an exclusive text, it's an inclusive way. God so loved the world.
And notice it says what's really interesting, I will just say on that, is that 3:16 says God so loved, it actually says God, right? What is that? 14:10? I know it's one of the numbers. And notice there it doesn't say no one comes to God. It says no one comes to the Father except through me. And actually, that is the Christian confessional claim. That for Christians, it is the Son. That's the way God has come to us, is through the incarnation. But it's not making a universalizing statement. It's making a statement about Christianity. So yes, both of those things. But 3:16, because it's important that you have both God. I mean, it's interesting to actually track in the Gospel of John where God is used and where Father is used. That's something really important to note. So yeah, thanks for saying that.
So once again, join with me in thanking them. And if you would like to greet her outside this door, this is the opportunity to do that. In this room at 3:30, Rachel McGuire will be here, the pastor from Emmanuel Church on Park Avenue, who will talk to us about community gardening that her community has done in 3 spaces now in the Parcells Avenue area. And then this evening in this space at 7 o'clock will be Patrick Chang, who is our LGBT speaker. And we hope that you'll come this evening to be with us for that event as well. Just to keep you in the loop about opportunities for continuing ed here at CRCDS, You may have seen the flyer on the table or in the bulletin this morning and yesterday at worship. The Rochester Consortium of Theological Schools, CRCDS, our partners in ministry at Roberts Wesleyan and at St. Bernard's have committed to having a preaching opportunity of learning each spring. And last year, Dr. McMickle was our presenter. This year, Richard Middleton from Northeastern will be the presenter, as well as Esau McCauley. And we will be at St. Bernard's. That event happens on May 21st for the day from 9 to 3. And you can register online for that event. So we invite you to join us. And then I remind you that our next lecture week is the first full week of October. So October 5 through 8. And our topic is, in Christ there is no able or disabled, as we look at accessibility and belonging in the Commonwealth of God. And so we invite you to continue to come to the Hill, to have conversations and to stretch and grow as people of God. Thank you so much for being with us. I know that we're all waiting to fill out those evaluations, and I know you'll do so and leave them right there on the table for the committee. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.